1,000,000 years ago, back when time had little meaning, in an unknown forest of some unnamed region of a forgotten continent, a man sat crouched in a bush. Snow blanketed the earth, wrapping it in the blight's chilly embrace, as it had done for millions of years. The barren, gray trees whispered and croaked their slow, solemn stories. The birds had long retired, their tittering and chirping, their witty retorts and cheerful conversations laid to rest. Night had enveloped the landscape. The man must return soon. Twigs and leaves snagged at his pelt, the only armor he had against the raging winds and biting chill. Fire his only weapon, the hope for a future beyond his only constitution. A rustle, quicker than one could rightfully take in, the spear poised to strike at the slightest notion of movement, flew from the hunter's hands and directly into the heart of an unsuspecting jackrabbit. The man hooted a cry of victory and flailed about in the manner so accustomed to an excited human. Finally, yes, finally, I can go home. Humans had long before acquired the capacity for complex language, something entirely unique to them, and probably the only reason they ever left infancy as a species. Language has many tactical advantages, as one could imagine, but more than anything, it helps satisfy, or at least salve, possibly the greatest need of humans, when they have the time to need it, of course. The need for purpose, meaning, a reason to live. Early humans weathered their dull lives by finding meaning in those trapped in that crude age with them. They told stories, they daydreamed, they thought the same terrible thoughts that plagued the human condition from its inception to its end. The man was inspecting the kill, getting ready to carry it back to the rudimentary housing a nearby cave provided, when he spotted something. There, peeking through the foliage, was a sliver of silver light. Surely enough, the full moon came into view and on display, shrouded only by the expansive forest dotting the earth it oversaw. It peered down at the man. He took a moment and peered back, gazed at its rocky surface, its etched patterns of craters. Locked there, man and moon, in that moment that felt like forever, the human allowed himself to wonder. He wondered what the moon had seen before. His father had looked upon it, had he not? And his before him, and his before that, and so on. He wondered who was looking at it now, if there were others beyond his tribe, braving the dark the same as him. He wondered who would look at it in the future, what their life would be like. It was hard to imagine one different from his own, but maybe one day humanity would finally be beyond just subsisting and surviving, and would move on to greater things, thriving, aspiring, and maybe, just maybe, truly living. Until then, there was always the moon. It is to be done tomorrow, Brutus, Cassius said. It has to be. For the good of Rome, eh? Brutus replied, breathing a sigh. He leaned over the wall bordering a stone balcony overlooking Rome, the flickering light of fires and torches illuminating the sprawling cityscape, only outdone by the luminous gem hanging in the sky, casting its silent light as it had done for ages past. I don't know, Cassius. I'm afraid of what may come next. What comes next? What comes next? Well, my friend, you know what comes next. The restoration of Rome, the preservation of its sacred order. What could you mean, what comes next? Brutus's partner retorted, giving him a most confused look. Caesar's would-be assassin turned away from the picturesque scene, his eyes flicked to Cassius's. I mean, Cassius, what if it goes wrong? What if, Brutus gestured his hand out to the city, what if we're wrong? What if he's what Rome needs? Or what if he's what Rome needs? Bellowed Cassius. You must be joking, Brutus, or ill. We've spoken about this. He is weak, he is vile, he is unfit for rule. Moreover, he has declared himself dictator for life. Caesar is a king, Brutus. He spat the word as if it was bile corrupting his mouth. Whether the people recognize it or not, we are the only ones who can do something. With those words, he grasped Brutus by the shoulders, bringing the once noble senator close. We are Rome's last hope. Brutus scanned Cassius's desperate face, his pleading, sunken eyes, and sighed. Of course, my friend, of course. Cassius's vice grip relaxed, his face softened, his arms fell to his sides. You will be ready tomorrow. I will. Good. And with that, Cassius turned, swishing his toga as he walked back into the atrium, held by great pillars of gilded marble. He stopped abruptly. Looking back, worry etched into his face, he uttered his farewell. Long live Rome. Brutus returned the stare. A moment passed between them, both men frozen in contemplation. What if Brutus was working for Caesar? It couldn't be. The plan wouldn't have gotten this far as such. What if Cassius was making a mistake? Was Brutus truly willing to commit such a heinous act in the favor of Rome? Was Caesar's death truly the tonic to Rome's weakness? "Farewell, my friend," Brutus replied, and turned back to the city. Cassius's footsteps echoed with more than just the sound of his feet hitting stone. "And long live Rome," Brutus muttered, pulling a knife from its sheath and twirling the point into the tip of his index finger. He gazed up at the moon, at Diana, the goddess of the hunt. She had overlooked humanity in her quiet way, unlike her brazen and blazing brother Apollo for millennia. She had watched them from their inception. She was there when Romulus killed Remus, and so began Rome. She was there when the first kings fell and the Senate established. She was there when Pompey lay slain by Caesar's hand, and she would remain for whatever was fated to come next. Be it misfortune, misstep, or triumph, she had always been there. She would see them through. Brutus uttered a silent prayer. It was the dead of night, and a young man was trudging down the carpeted stairs of his house on his way to the kitchen for a glass of water. He grabbed a glass from the cabinet, careful to close it ever so gently as to not wake his family sleeping just above him. Quietly, he worked the freezer door open, trying and failing, much to his dismay, to put ice in his cup silently. Finally, he poured some water from the filter and made his way back to the stairs. When he walked into the entrance of his house, a tall area painted bright blue with windows to the outside, he was taken aback to see it awash with light. A soft, gentle luminance spilling from the windows in glorious rays, something he had never seen the moon do, not in such a bold style. It was full, possibly a supermoon, and it took up much of the small window situated above the door. He sat on the stairs, drinking his water, and took in the beauty, because it was beautiful and serene. One could make out every crater and crevice. He imagined that if he only had a telescope and knew the location, he could easily find the American flag up there, somewhere. It was wild to think that anyone, particularly those of his country, had actually been there. It was a place, another celestial body, and disregarding technical classification, it was essentially another planet. He wasn't looking at an image in some skybox, a picture or projection. He was looking at a giant rock in space, hundreds of thousands of miles away. It was a type of wonder he rarely experienced. An aspiring writer, he had already begun imagining the people who had looked at the same imagery as him. How many a lover had gazed upon the crown jewel of the night sky as he was? How many were doing so now, contemplating life, or lamenting over love, or simply enjoying the view? The Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians, those before and after, all of them had seen it. Every celebrity and politician. President Truman went to sleep looking at that moon after authorizing the nuke's first use. The pilot who dropped the horrendous thing watched that great silver observer crest the horizon that very same night of his disastrous action. And those who died, ripped apart atom by atom, would never see it again. Every piece of media containing the moon, every poem and allusion and myth and metaphor, they were all talking about the same physical, tangible thing. The moon had always been there, hadn't it? We always see the same face, the same patterns, the same craters. Every human graced with the gift of sight had set their eyes on its timeless surface. It's the same moon that watched over those struggling humans in the early days. It's the same moon that hung in the sky while Rome fell. It's the same moon 1,000 unknown souls looked upon as the light left their eyes, bloody, wounded, or ill. It's the same moon. He couldn't wait for humanity to venture back once more. Dr. Marley Tuller lorded over her operation with a keen eye and keener criticisms. The obelisk, sitting in the center of the lunar facility, the one brimming with the most advanced technology the collected world nations could provide, all focused on cracking the thing, remained stubbornly resolute to keep its secrets. She frowned, noticing an error in a system's calibration, and barked an order at some scientist or another. Just beyond the layer of bulletproof, radioactive protectant glass separating her and the obelisk, a dozen or so researchers took samples and readings of everything. The moon dust nearby, radioactivity scans, light detectors of all kinds, all of which told them inevitably nothing new. A few of them just took pictures of the thing, that monolith, stumping every modern scientist just when humanity was beginning to believe it understood things, like a toddler tripping over its first steps. It was beautiful in a menacing kind of way. Clearly it was made of no known substance because it defied readings of all kinds. If an onlooker didn't know better, they'd say it was made up of the same stuff black holes were. Nothing. Absolute emptiness. It wasn't black, it was void, a cutout in the world. Light shined at it had no effect. Photos looked as if someone had perfectly trimmed the outline of a 3 meter by 1 meter cube from the image. The human eye defied the mind. Some philosopher types on the edge of scientific study suggested that maybe, just maybe, it was made up of some matter stuff that either the human eye or mind simply couldn't behold. So then the question remained, what could? It was found by accident, a complete fluke. A satellite set on scanning the surface of the moon, finally mapping it to the new standard centimeter squared density, had a hole in its render. Upon remapping the area, the hole seemingly remained. Further inquiry into the integrity of the machines and software was needed, and sustained, no errors of any kind. Finally, someone, an insufferable perfectionist probably, suggested visiting the area for themselves and just mapping it with manual technology. You can imagine their shock. Obviously, an expedition was launched to see what the monolith was, and once its oddities were uncovered more and more, its reluctance to return any information being paramount, it began attracting more attention. Before long, the greatest minds of humanity, once boasting their near total control of the sciences, were brandished on a fresh, difficult problem. What was the thing? It had been Dr. Toller herself after arriving from a lab on the surface of Jupiter, which, of course, was largely focused on the solving of quantum probabilities and therefore attempting to predict every action to ever be taken, who had discovered the only information they had. Apparently, a singular particle of some unknown substance wriggled its way out and escaped the limitless dark. Not only this, but said particle had defied everything humanity had built upon, and believed to be true, if the readings were correct, and they most certainly absolutely weren't, of course, the scientific community resolved. If they were correct, however, then that stubborn little mind-bending particle had been traveling at a speed greater than light. The infuriating part was replicating the results. 1,000 score stimuli had been tried and tried again and again, attempting to get the obelisk to belch once more. At first, they had waited, surrounding it with every kind of instrument that could be thought of in hopes of the phenomena reoccurring. When that didn't work, they tried electrical shocks, radio waves, beams of intense infrared and UV light, experimental induced quantum fluctuations, and once just a plain old hammer. All science boils down to hitting things with sticks, eventually. No result. Now, Dr. Toller sat, 2 months after the initial discovery, facing obstinate opposition. Clearly, it was a mistake, the entrenched and stale scientific community claimed. Humanity had been exploring the idea of faster-than-light travel for hundreds of years, particularly since the Pluto stranding incident. It was simply, as they said, impossible. Such a revelation would undermine the presupposed physics of everything. The scope was simply too large to properly estimate. No, they'd reached a dead end. It was impossible and frankly irreverent to declare anything otherwise. Toller's readings and such, she rebutted often that it was Dr. Toller, but this was usually dismissed, were just plain wrong. What would you have us believe, the common argument began, during the ever-so-important discussions that Dr. Toller herself was only invited to out of necessity, she was sure. That every calculation ever done was incorrect, that long-standing and proven theory was unfounded, that we have no true understanding of the world that we inhabit? Yes. A blip. There it was, a blip on the screen. Something just whizzed by. Something fast. Quickly, the doctor checked everything she could. It wasn't an error or a fluke or a mistake. More than a dozen of the capable instruments had picked up on it. Dr. Toller smiled a wide, cathartic smile. The blip, the Toller blip, as it would come to be known for the millennia after, had been traveling at exactly 1 meter per second over the speed of light. This changed everything. It was the end of days, but the beginning of something new. Maybe not new days, that word and the meaning behind it may be put to rest now, as all things, good and bad, of this universe shall be. The humans had spent their time dawdling about the grand expanse, flexing their cosmic strength and pissing about like usual, until they eventually moved on from such primal things. Now they ripped apart galaxies instead of planets to pass the time. Call it evolution or something more contemporary, humanity remained as a facet of itself, but one distant from its origins. I will call it aging. For as one moves through the early stages of life, so had humanity gone through its embarrassments, its bad times, its good times, and its eventual graduation from its premature tendencies. Now, they were gods. No planet nor star was untouched by their fingertips, no galaxy nor timeline left to its own devices. All had been shaped by the new titans of the void. Time had lost its meaning. A billion years could be but a blink of an eye and a second in eternity. Scale, whether it be temporal or physical or mental or dimensional, held no consequence. Not to them. The humans swirled and danced and did their human things amongst the cosmos, albeit in ways their ancestors could have only imagined, and even then severely limited by the prehistoric minds of the time. Galaxies rendered the leftover bits from a party unbeknownst to lower creatures. Electrons made palaces of nebulae and chocolate. They were always quite partial to chocolate. But every party has its last song, and every play has its closing scene, and every book has its final chapter. Then you move on to the next. Every child grows old, every teen matures, every fresh adult walks into their new world expecting control but receiving only confusion. It was time for humanity to grow up. As one takes one last look at a childhood room before going off to college, the gods of this world reminisced about their origins. What was that one world? The one with the parties, and the cats, and the war. Where had they left it? Ah, yes, there it was, in an unknown corner of an unnamed arm of some galaxy forgotten, the mother planet. But it was too painful to look at it how it was. Devastated with the remains of empires billions of years past, bits and pieces of civilizations meant to last to the end of time crumbling before it. A few of the visitors grimaced. No, this wouldn't do, but it felt wrong to whisk it all away. The pain was worth remembering. Oh, right, it had a moon. The moon. That would do nicely. Wasn't this meant to be gone by now? Some asked. This system is old. That star should be dead. Another, one of the eldest and therefore most knowledgeable of his family's recountings, replied, gesturing in an unfathomable manner towards a star that lorded over his grandfather's grandfather's homeworld. Yes, but they stopped it. Look. And they did look. Some great archaic machinations sprawl across the inflated and red star, webbed and creeping like some ancient and decrepit metal vine. What is it? Well, they couldn't have had their home star dying on them, could they? Some preservation fanatic or history professor likely had it constructed to stall the end of this world. Were people living here at the time? Of course. I think there's people, if you can call them that, living in the machine now. And so they looked closer, and indeed there were. Little gray goblin-like creatures with red eyes and pointed ears ran around the Colossus, obviously ignorant to the godlike beings observing them, and clearly working hard to keep the foreboding tendrils alive and well. They seemed to have language and economy and hopes and dreams and aspirations too. Why didn't they leave? Maybe it was all they'd known. Maybe it was all they'd ever known. I believe the humans of old tampered with DNA at some point or another, the elder said. Whatever for, came the consensus, and the eldest just shrugged. And that was the result. The elder remained silent. This disturbed this small collection, waiting on the moon, waiting for their brethren to finish up the final things before the universe collapsed in on itself with the fury only all of creation could bring. With a flick of some existential wrist, the spindly monstrosity was gone. It might have never happened to begin with. It didn't matter anyhow. Not much did now. A billion years could have passed in that timeless manner, as well as could have a moment so minuscule we couldn't name it, but eventually, they arrived, the new humans, older than any of their ancestors, driven by a thousand motivations unfathomable to us. They arrived. After extravaganzas that lit up the starry night and wars that tore it apart, after the vitriol of humanity and the destruction it had wrought, after the creativity of man and the beauty it had brought, all, finally, had a collected thought, to move on. They had arrived. It was time, it had been for a while, but before they began their great song and dance into the new expanse, leaving this dying and stale plane of existence behind for something fresh and exciting, a voice spoke up from the crowd. And what is to come of them next time? What? The humans, those next. Well, I suppose they will warble and waltz and wreak havoc like we have. But isn't that cruel? How so? To leave them unfettered and unknowing, to give them no guidance from the wisdom we have finally achieved. This prompted a moment of silence, the universe halting as the humans went quiet for the first time and possibly forever. I believe it would be. Let us send a message to the before times. And so the only question remained, the last question of all, what to leave behind. One suggested they rearrange the stars into a message, but that was dismissed quickly. It's been done before. Another suggested a weapon of some sort to defend themselves, to which he received many quizzical and judgmental looks. Against what, was the rebuttal? Their own selves? Finally, it was yet another who thought to give them wonder, for, as she put it, wonder keeps them, kept us alive and looking up. Let them blunder along their lives, blind and dumb, but in those moments of lonely ponder let them revel and sonder. When questioned how they would accomplish this, the elder piped up. An obelisk, a monolith. Remember the days of old when limits seemed so movable and set. It took us many a millennia to undo their effects. The obelisk will evaporate slowly and without warning, and it will do so at a speed ever so slightly greater than that of light, that ever-troubling constraint, with which our early selves were forced to fight. So it was made, blacker than night, bolder than day, made of some new matter only found at the end of such words as meanings. Once it was complete, once there were no more shackles to hold them down, once the last humans had all said their goodbyes and uttered their last prayers, they ascended into whatever awaited them in that odd new realm, and the universe was left without a pilot at the helm. Finally, its own devices set in. It had no pesky know-it-all children to look after. They were on their own now. Finally, it could reminisce about times past, and finally, it could remember fondly the laughter had, and finally, it could wince at scars set to last. Finally, oh, finally, it could let itself pass. A few billion years in the future, when time would have little meaning, in an unknown forest of some unnamed region of a forgotten continent on a small planet somewhere in a galaxy tucked into the corner of the universe, a man stood, peering up at the moon, peering down at him. Locked there, man and moon, in that moment that could last forever, he allowed himself to wonder.